Hello and welcome. My name is Cliff, and today we're going to be taking a look at Forbidden Land, Rogues and Raiders in a Cursed World. This game is made by Free League, but it's put out by Modifius. I will include links where you can get it in the description below. I expect this video might be pretty long. There's a lot of content to get through. So I'm going to start with the pros and cons of what I like about this game and what I don't. For the most part, I really like this game, and I'm considering switching to it from what I'm playing right now, which is either Dungeon World or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. So the main thing I like about this game is that it has ingrained mechanics for survival campaigns, specifically hex crawls, which it comes with a hex crawl setting. It does a very good job of building this loop where you wear down your characters and their gear, and then giving them ways to sort of heal and fix their gear, or even create new gear. That may sound a lot like other games, but it does this in a different way where you actually wear down your abilities and your gear takes damage. I'm sure these mechanics are in some other games, but this game felt a little bit more unique to me, and we'll see why as we get further into the video. Another aspect of the mechanics that I like is that, to go along with that, it has fairly good mechanics for developing an adventure or campaign that fits into sort of a hex crawl or any sort of... It has good mechanics for running a campaign where your characters or your players are in charge of what's happening, and it's more player driven than GM driven, if that makes sense. And then finally, another thing I really like about this game, which doesn't mean a whole lot for some people, but it means a lot to me, it's an aspect of games that I care a lot about, is the art. So, for example, you can go and print up a lot of the art for many of the adventure sites that either come in this box or come in one of the expansion books. Right now there's 2 expansion books. So you can go on to the Free League website and download a PDF and print up all of the art. So you could use these in other games if you wish. But here's an example of the Hollows. So this is a map they put out, and I really like this style. It has a very sort of old school fantasy style that it's both functional and aesthetic. And I think I would struggle to find a game with an aesthetic that I like more than this one. Here's another example of Grindbone. These are the three adventure sites that come in the GM handbook, which comes in this box. And then here's Veil of the Dead. Finally, there are a few things that I don't like about this game. I do think the system is what I really like about this game. The actual pre-written adventures, or especially, I think the adventures are okay, but the history and campaign setting I find a little dry. It's not quite to my taste, and unfortunately they've kind of tied themselves into the setting quite a bit. There's no reason you can't run the mechanics in another setting, which is absolutely what I plan on doing. But the game is named after their setting. And I just feel like maybe it's a little too strongly tied to the setting and their world building. So we'll take a look at that more as we dive into the books. Another thing I worry about this game, and it kind of ties to my first concern, is the adventures. While they're very beautiful and they have this beautiful art, I worry about the layout of the text in the book. I worry about its usability at the table. I feel like I would have to prepare a lot of notes, and I will find out. I'm planning on running some of this soon. I have actually run one session of this, which brings me to my last concern, which is conversion of other material into this system. I ran a Lamentations of the Flame Princess module. I ran Blood in the Chocolate with this system. And it actually worked out pretty well, but there's not a lot of... I didn't see any information in the books on converting from other systems to this, and I think that's something very helpful to put in books, especially if it's a smaller game without a lot of content. Like if it's especially if it's not very similar to other games, and then you're not going to be putting out a whole lot of content, which I do think they expect to. I think it really helps to talk about how to convert other material into this game. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and start taking a look at the actual system. So I think the first thing I'm going to do is let's take a look at Let's go ahead and take a look at the character sheet, because you can learn a lot by looking at character sheets about how a game works. So, come back to that. So this is your basic character sheet. This is the one that comes with the game, and you can go to the website, download it, and print it up. So there's 4 attributes as opposed to the normal 6. There's strength, agility, wits, and empathy. You'll notice there is no hit points because you actually take damage straight to these attributes, and you can take damage to all of them. Strength is the closest thing you would have to hit points. All right. So what kind of happens as you play the game is, let me see how much room I have here. There are these special dice you roll. It is a dice pool system. So for example, you might have, let's say you have 3 strength, in which case when you want to roll, you would take 3 of your base dice. And then you want to make a melee attack, so you would take your melee skill. Let's say we have 2 melee skill. So you would take 2 of those dice. And then if you have a weapon that gives you +1 to your roll, we would roll these 6 dice. Let me move this out of the way. Sorry, that was probably very annoying on the microphone. So it would look like this. All right. And so this is a success. 6s are successes, 1s are failures. This is a pretty similar mechanic to many dice pooling games. But let's say we wanted to go ahead and try and get more damage out of this. We could push the roll. You don't re-roll 1s. So, wow, that's a pretty good roll. In this case, we would do whatever our base damage is, which might be, let's say it's 2, plus an additional 3. So we have our success and then 3 extra successes, so you would do 3 extra damage. However, we have this Bane, so we rolled a 1 on our one of our base dice. So we actually also take a damage to our strength. And so now when we roll in the future, we're down a dice. And so as you take damage, you lose dice. Your gear can take damage, and so you might lose or even break your gear. In fact, when you run out of base dice, or when your attribute gets to 0, you become what the game calls broken. So it's like unconscious. At that point, you might take critical injuries. There's also additions. There's armor to negate damage, at least physical damage. And then there's a bunch of talents, and there are spells and things like that. One other thing that happens when you take damage in this specific way, so if you had pushed your roll, and gotten a Bane, you would get a number of willpower equivalent to the number of Banes you rolled. So there's this loop where you're sort of, making rolls and pushing them, and you're wearing your character down, but you're also building up your willpower, and in turn, that willpower is used for talents and spells. So you kind of like turn you kind of turn your failures into additional abilities, but then that gets spent as well, and eventually you kind of need to rest and fix your items and stuff like that. So this creates this sort of survival loop, which I think is very interesting, and in play, I think it plays out well, and it feels quite a bit different from other systems, in my opinion. All right. Well, we might come back to this, but there's one other aspect of the game which I have not actually played with, but you can get a stronghold, and there are rules in the books for strongholds. They kind of, get you ways to produce goods, and you can get hirelings, and I suppose you could probably have, military encounters at your strongholds. I think that would be pretty fun. I've never played a game where I actually did that stuff, but I am interested in doing it at some point. All right, let's go ahead and open the box. Alrighty then. All right. So this is what comes in the box. You get a player's handbook, which is, these books they have this sort of, foil to them, and they're these faux leather bound, which is very nice. They feel really great. They have excellent hand feel. All right. You get this extra little book, which is, it sort of extends your, it's full of random tables, and it sort of extends your character building and adventure building. And finally, you get a map, which is a hex map, and you use it for the hex crawl of the game. And then you get a bunch of stickers, so you can place down adventure sites that you found. They are not in fixed locations on the map. The GM can decide where they are, which I think is a very cool idea, and I think it's an idea I'd like to see expanded upon in other games, or in just other adventure modules. And then there's like gravestones, so if you lose a character, you can mark where the character was lost, and some of these are not named, so you can create your own and mark them with a sticker. It's pretty cool. I don't know if I have enough room to actually open the map, but let's give it a shot. It is a pretty big map, poster size. That'll probably cover most of it, and there's some glare. Sorry about that. But yeah, it's a pretty nice map. I really like the art style, or the art that comes with this game. I don't think I have a complaint with any piece of art that I've seen. There you go, there's your map. And there are these areas marked out, sort of regions, and there's information about, like the type of people who live there, races and whatnot. All right. Let's go ahead and start by looking at the player's handbook. So again, they feel very nice. Excellent books. I love the way they did these books. They have the map again on the inside cover of the books. So let's see. And you can download like the first portion of this book as quick start rules on the website, and I'll include links for all that stuff. All right. So, they have an introduction, kind of how you play the game, and what the game's about. They go over the character sheets, the stickers, the dice. There are cards. You use cards for initiative, and you also use cards. There's a mechanic when you're kind of dueling someone, I think, where you secretively select the actions you're going to take. I haven't tried this, but it seems like fun. There's also cards for... I do have the cards, but unfortunately I didn't bring them in here. There's also cards for items. Let's see. So this race, they call races kin in this game for whatever reason. And so there's kind of... the game is very... Like I said, it's kind of dry, so it's mostly got very standard races. There's human, elf, half-elf, dwarf, halfling. I will say that when you read through these descriptions, a lot of the descriptions are very adversarial. So it feels like within this game world and the sort of world building they've done, it would be weird to have a very mixed party. Like most of the races straight up hate humans. So I don't know. There's something about that feels weird. It talks about how halflings beat their children, which is interesting. It's kind of funny, but then it's also, I don't know, there's something about the world building that hasn't quite struck a chord with me. They do have wolfkins, which is cool, and that was annoying. So then there's also, you can play orcs and goblins, which is cool. I like to see that kind of stuff. And then it gets straight into your classes. The classes are a little non-standard. There's no cleric. I think that's the biggest exception. That role is kind of filled by the druid. So the druid is both like survival and the healer. Then there's the fighter, the hunter. So there's like your ranger. The minstrel. So this is your bard, but it also plays a somewhat important role in that they have some specialization in healing, I think, wits and empathy, so your mental stats, which is, I think that's an interesting way to make the bard a little bit more critical. I don't know, there's not a lot of things that deal damage to the mental stats, but there's definitely enough to where it would be very helpful to have a minstrel. There's a peddler, which this is an interesting addition. So they specialize in trade and crafting, which is a nice thing to have. There's a rider, which is, again, somewhat like a ranger, but a little bit more specialized on, horseback fighting. The rogue, pretty standard. Sorcerer, again, pretty standard. And then in this game, age matters quite a bit. And again, this is one thing about the system that's kind of weird to me. I feel like the way so depending on how young you are, so there's young, adult, and old, and the age that fits differs by kin. And so I feel like the advantage of being old far outweighs the advantage of being young. I think the only advantage to being young is you get 2 additional attribute points. So that's like 2 more hit points or 2 more dice versus being old. But you get 4 more skill points. And when you roll skills, so if you're old, you get 4 additional skill points. And when you roll skills, ones don't have any banes. Your skills never go down from wear. They always stay the same. So I feel like skills are more useful in the game than attributes. And then you also get more of them this way than you're losing. So I don't know. I'd have to see how it plays out in the long run, but the balance seems a little off. And then on top of that, you get 2 additional talents, and talents are very useful. So I don't know. I think that's the only differences. I don't remember there being any other difference by age. Oh, you also get 2 additional reputation. Reputation can be a bad thing in certain situations, I think. But I don't think that offsets the other benefits at all. Well, I guess we'll see. So this game has what they call pride. So you take your pride in something, and this you can use it every once in a while to sort of help you get. It can help you make a roll that you otherwise might not. So if you pride yourself on always, so their example, their sorcerer's pride is nothing scares me as I've seen the world behind the veil. So maybe it would help you with your fear tests or something like that. And you can lose it. So I think if you try to use your pride and you still fail the roll, then you actually will lose your pride. Which is pretty interesting. You have a dark secret. This works kind of like bonds in other games, or it's that's annoying. So it's kind of like your relationship, not necessarily with other people, but with the world, and it could be with other people, of course. Gear is kind of straightforward for the most part. We'll get to that when we get to it. Encumbrance. There is encumbrance in this game, of course. It's a survival game. Let's see. Experience. Experience is kind of based on what you did in a session. So you don't get experience from killing a specific monster. You don't get like 3 experience for killing, a goblin or something. It's like how much you traveled, or discoveries, or defeating does give experience. Getting treasure, adding to your stronghold, risking your life for another PC. You do get participation experience. I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like you need to earn your experience, but that's maybe just my opinion. Of course, you can modify this as much as you want. All right, let's see what else. Your reputation. So your reputation, you actually make a roll when you go into a civilized area, so like a town, and you roll a number of dice equal to your reputation, and depending if the number of successes you have, so then on the dice it's a 6, but or swords, either way it's always marked as swords in the book, or a skull for a 1. Anyway, however many successes you have, or I think it's only if you succeed at all, you'll be recognized, and being recognized can be a bad thing sometimes, especially if you can have a reputation for not necessarily being a good person. There's no alignment in this game, but I think it's up to the GM, like what you're recognized for the most part. So this is a somewhat skill-based game. So there's 16 skills, 4 for each attribute. And the skills do have a little bit more than just pass, fail, depending on what you are doing. They'll have a little bit of specifics to each of the skills. Let's take a look. For example, like there's crafting, and so the way you craft items is a little bit more involved than just like, do you craft it? So that is something about this game which I worry a little bit. I'm sure you would. There's only 16 of them, so I think you would learn them over time of just playing the game. But I think when you're just starting out, you're going to be turning to these skills quite a lot and kind of wondering how they work. Some of them are pretty straightforward, and this comes up in a few different places. It also comes up in combat, because there's a lot of combat moves, which are not exactly straightforward. All right. But there you go. Let's move on. And then there's talents, which there's a talent for every kin, and then so you'll by default have one talent for your kin, and then there are 3 paths for every class, and then there are general talents you can take. And there's quite a bit of them. And then talents rank up, so a lot of them, especially the class ones, they'll all have 3 ranks, and as you get higher, you can do more and more stuff, and they're more and more powerful. Overall, I think this system seems pretty good. I don't have any complaints with it, but again, it's something that will take learning, which is true of most games. Alright, let's keep going. So in combat, you draw cards for initiative, so there's a 1 through 10 card, and you just kind of deal them out. If you have more monsters than cards, then you start pooling monsters together, and they'll go on the same initiative card. So it's pretty straightforward, and I like that because it's pretty quick, and it solves conflicts because you can't really conflict. So here are the combat actions. As you can see, there's quite a bit of them. There's slow actions and fast actions. You get 1 slow action, 1 fast action. Some talents and things might create exceptions, but there's however many slow actions, and there's even more fast actions, and these all have specific rules. So it's not. Let me see where are the rules. I have it marked for probably good reason. Yeah, I think this is something that when you're first starting, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to look up the rules for these actions, which is a little unfortunate, but it's not too bad. And most of them many of them do tie to some skill, which makes sense. You're going to be rolling to determine what happens, and it's generally skill-based. So, but for example, you could slash or you could stab, so there's a decision of how you're actually going to attack your enemy. Then, of course, you can punch, kick, and bite, grapple. A lot of this stuff does exist in other systems, but it is nice that it presents these as like, these are your options, and you can choose one. But I do worry about players, falling back on that and kind of getting away from the narrative a bit. But that's kind of up to your taste, I think. This is a zoned game, which means that it's not based on, like 5-foot squares. It's based on generally like a room is a zone, and then there's a special zone for arm's length, so right next to you. And then, maybe in the next room is short, and then bigger zones might have long or distant, which so distant as far as the eye can see. Long says up to 100 meters. So they give you a general sense of how long it is, so you could do some conversion. But it's pretty intuitive, I think. And then, you have to actually roll to be able to flee, which makes me think of Final Fantasy and things like that. Pretty interesting. What else? There are rules for social conflicts, which I like. A lot of games I feel like don't discuss this very much. So there's like negotiating your position, and there's modifiers. I think in the rules for manipulation, they maybe even go into further depth. But generally, like, the more people you have on your side and the more leverage you have and things like that, you'll get modifiers and vice versa. So if they have if you're trying to convince 20 orcs to do something, it's probably not going to be a very easy roll. It is nice that those rules are there. So here's your weapons table. So you'll get, generally it's 1 or 2 extra dice. There are special, so magic weapons in this game are handled not always by adding additional dice, but you might add what are called artifact dice. So it'll be a D8, a D10, or a D12. And the more you roll, like, for example, if you roll a 12 on the D12, you'll get 4 successes. So it does, like, extra damage just from that. And I think that's a pretty cool system. I'd like to see a little bit more how it plays out. I gave one person in the session I ran a artifact. It was the bad guy. An artifact weapon, and so I only got to use it a little bit. But it's a pretty interesting idea. There's ranged weapons. So armor and cover is also handled by rolling dice. So when you attack someone, they get to roll their armor, and so the more successes they have, the more it negates. If they don't manage to actually soak up all of the damage, then their armor becomes damaged. And then for cover, you add more and more dice. A stone wall is like 8 dice, which is pretty cool. Although, I guess this is a good time as any to point out, I am a little worried about the amount, like the sheer quantity of dice that you were rolling sometimes. It wasn't bad in the session I ran, but like in theory, you could be rolling, 12 dice for a roll sometimes. Seems pretty unlikely, and in fact, some monsters do have abilities that take 12 dice. So if you don't like rolling dice, this might not be the game for you. If you like rolling dice, and I like rolling dice, you might really like that. Here's your conditions. So there's 4 conditions: hungry, thirsty, sleepy, and cold. And they just, have different roll modifications. So this isn't exactly a rules light game. It feels a little lighter than 5th edition D&D to me, in a lot of ways, but I would not call this a rules light game. Let's see. I just want to point out one thing. I really like that they have all of these illustrated weapons. I feel like maybe some of the older D&D books had this. Maybe 2nd edition. I can't remember, but I don't know. I really like this. The art in these books. It's fantastic. All right. Anyway, back on track. There's rules for, disease and riding animals. You can have opposed rolls, and the way poison and disease and I think saves in general, that's not really a term that's used in here too much, but generally you'll roll maybe endurance, or it's usually endurance, at least for poison and disease. You will roll against the poison. So maybe the poison has a potency of 3 or 6 or 9, and that's how many dice the GM rolls for the poison, and then you need to beat that number. We had to use that a lot in Blood in the Chocolate because there's a lot of poisons in that game, or in that module. But I think it worked out pretty well. I like the system. All right, so then we get to magic. There are magical mishaps in this game, which is another thing that I love. And one of them, there are some instant death cases in this game. They're quite rare. I think it's easy to get broken in this game, but a little hard to actually die. But I will point out that if you roll 2 6s on a magical mishap, you do lose your character. So it says, your magic rips open a rift to another dimension and a demon pulls you over to the other side. Time to make a new character. Your old character will come back as an NPC after D66 days, but will be changed. So some people will not like that. I think, so the way, I can't remember the exact way that a mishap happens, but I think as you don't have to, your spells always succeed. You spend willpower to cast a spell and it will always succeed, but you do roll dice, which is equal, so it's equal to the number of willpower points you spend. And if you roll a skull, so if you roll a 1, you'll have a mishap. However, the more successes you roll, the more overpowered the spell, or overcharged the spell becomes. So, for example, let's say we put 3 willpower in, and we get, we have a 1 and a 6. So it would be like I put 4 willpower in because I have a success, but I would also have to roll a magic mishap, in which case we'll call that a 15. Your magic makes you very hungry, so you take the hungry status. A lot of these are pretty minor. So, for example, 11 to 13, someone witnesses your magic and tells others, your reputation increases 1 step. If you want to be reputable, that's a good thing. But for the most part, they're not good. So then we get into the spells, and the spells are fine. I don't remember any of these sticking out to me as generally like very interesting. They're very thematic, so that's good. With one, I think the symbolism is interesting. So you are drawing symbols, and they will have an effect. This lets you do things like damaging wits. So I really like this. Not all monsters can be. Some monsters don't have all 4 attributes, and if they don't have all 4 attributes, you have to kill them with the attributes that they have. But if you're dealing with an NPC, and a lot of the big bad guys in many modules are people, it's like the cult leader or something. They're probably going to have all 4 attributes, and so you can defeat them. Sometimes the easier way to defeat them is not with their strength, like their physical hit points, but with their mind stats. So you might break them in their wits or their empathy. And these have specific effects, which we'll get to shortly. But I like that it creates alternative strategies to people that are dealing with bad guys or enemies that are handled well mechanically. So, for example, I feel like in D&D with this, you would have to kind of roleplay it out, and it feels very fudgy. But this has better mechanics for dealing with it. So while you're doing social conflicts, let's say the monster or the NPC could be pushing dice too. So you might break them just by arguing with them. And being broken mentally isn't quite as bad as being broken physically, but it's worth noting, and I think it's a very interesting system. But it will feel quite a bit different than like D&D. All right. Blood magic. This is interesting. So you can do things like hold a flame under your hand and, you know, boil somebody's blood. This actually does deal damage to strength. I think there was another one that deals damage to empathy. You can drive into like a bloodlust or something. But the spells, so, you know, despite what I said earlier, some of the spells are kind of interesting. And I think there's a lot of potential, and they do encourage you to create your own spells. There's not a whole lot of spells. There's, you know, like some systems have like pages and pages of spells, but, you know, it's a very small portion of the book relative to some other systems. So then they talk about going on journeys. So we get into like the rules for adventuring, and there are rules for, you know, time of day, forced march, and then you get into like mishaps while you're foraging, and there are rules for doing all these different survival tasks like fishing, making camp, rest, sleep. I haven't played with any of this yet, but I'm looking forward to trying it. There's some brief rules for exploring and sea travel. This is the kind of stuff I would like to see expanded out even a little bit further, because I like those aspects of games. But so at some point you can build or even take a stronghold, and you can start working. You can start managing your stronghold. So you get, you know, hirelings, and you can have it produce things. You can mess up and not pay your people, and they'll get mad, which is good or bad, depending on how you feel about that. You can, you know, fail to upkeep, fail to leave it guarded. I think this is pretty interesting, and it'll be a while before I get to play with this, but it seems pretty exciting. And I like what I've seen while looking through this. So they have some description of like functions you can add. So there's, you know, dungeons and gallows and forges and libraries and pastures, and they all do different things, which seems really fun. I don't think it's for every group, but I'm not even sure it's for my group, but I'm into it. All right, hirelings. And there's different hirelings. Let's see. And then there you get into events that can happen there. All right. But yeah, it's a pretty substantial part of the book. I would like to see even more on this, personally. Anyway, so here we get to gear. There's, you know, gear tables, all kinds of different things you can buy. And if you notice here, there's also raw materials, so you can actually craft probably all, if not all, of this stuff. So if you can find the stuff to make it, and you can roll a good enough smithing or skill, and you have like the location or whatever else you need, and it tells how long it takes to make it, so you can make whatever you need. And I think this is pretty important, because depending on the type of game you're playing or where you are, because your gear can break, you might have to replace it without access to like a shop or something. So it's pretty critical that this is actually in the book, and handled by the system. I mean, any system where you can actually break your gear, you need options on how you can replace it. There's buildings, and then we get into the way in the back here. They have the critical injuries tables. You can build buildings if you want. I think the peddler might have a way to build buildings, or gets bonuses to that. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's the peddler. All right. So critical injuries, depending on how you took the injury, so a slash wound, you'll roll on this table, the worst being decapitation, or a blunt force, the worst being a crushed skull. But they all, some of them, are instant death. Some of them are death after an amount of time if you're not healed. Generally, you're probably going to be healed unless you're like the last person standing kind of deal. This game, in a weird way, reminds me of, PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds, or maybe, Fortnite. I haven't played too much of Fortnite. But these games where you have a team and they start getting knocked down, they can die instantly, but if everyone gets knocked down, you're pretty much total party kill. But until that point, for the most part, people can be brought back up, because all you have to do is make a healing roll to bring somebody back up for any stat. A healing roll can heal any stat. All right. Anyway, so back to this. You get negatives to abilities until it's fully worked itself out. So, for example, there's a time limit and there's a healing time. So your time limit is like how long until you die, which only the worst case scenario, or the worst ones have. But then your healing time is how long until the negative effect goes away, which is pretty interesting. Stab wounds, pierced heart, not very good. Doesn't sound fun. Alright. And then there are other types of injuries. So horror, this is, I think, is when your wits are broken. You do not roll on a table when you don't roll when your empathy is broken. I think you either go into a blood rage or maybe something else happens. And I'm not sure, maybe your agility, I don't remember what happens when your agility is broken. Let's find out. This is one of the more interesting parts of the system, so I think it's probably interesting to know what happens. I think we probably went past it. Boo. I will try to cut this flipping out. Okay, broken. So your strength, I'm not going to cut the flipping out. You're knocked senseless, so this is when you roll. When your agility is broken, you also don't roll on one of the tables. But I think generally you're going to be taking damage to your strength. Agility is probably more from spells and maybe breaking it. You can become broken through pushing yourself. So you'll kind of like wear your skills down or your attributes down, but you don't roll if you're broken that way. You don't roll for a critical injury. That's like, you lifted too much stuff and you became too tired to do anything, basically. In the empathy, you also don't roll. You either explode in a violent outburst, kicking and breaking everything around you, or withdraw from everyone around you. In either way, you're uncommunicative until you've recovered a point of empathy. Yeah. All right. So that's this book. We're probably already pretty far into this video, but we are going to look at the GM book as well. And that's where we'll start getting into some of the things I don't like about the system. Or at least some of my concerns. Okay, so here we go. This is the GM book. Again, very nice, very similar. There's some information on the principles of the game. The world lies before you. The land is full of legends. This is something I do think is interesting about the game. So, similar to the art or the maps that you can go print up, you can print up, in every adventure site will have a legend. So you can go and print these up, or they're, in the book where with the legends or with the adventure sites. But the sort of impetus to go and explore some location is often driven by a legend. And I do think that is interesting. I don't know if I like the world building that goes into these legends, but I do like the idea, and they do give you tools for building your own legends. So it's pretty cool. The adventurers make their own fate, so yes, it is very player driven. Nothing is for free, so generally you want to make life hard, and the system does a pretty good job of that on its own. Then that's got shall lose, so generally the more you have in possessions, the more your attention you'll bring to yourself. This kind of ties into reputation a little bit. Like as you build up your stronghold and stuff, your reputation will go up. Death is part of the story, so it's expected to eventually kind of die. And that's why you get stickers with tombstones. The end is never set, so there is no... They don't suggest having like planned... this is designed for player-driven stuff. It's not designed for like the GM is trying to drive you to some specific ending or whatever. Okay, there's guides for prep and, you know, running the first session and stuff like that. Again, there's more information on strongholds and things that can happen there. And I do think some of these like random events are at least somewhat provocative. I don't remember any of these specifically standing out, but I didn't dive too deeply into the stronghold stuff. So then there's a section on the history, which, you know, is detailed. And it goes through many years, many years, many years, and many more years. This does nothing for me. I think this is too much. It's not very long. You could read through this if you wanted, and I read through some of it. This shows up again in the campaign book, Raven's Purge, which I'll review separately. But I don't know. I was not captivated by the history that this game kind of builds itself around. There are a selection of gods. They generally have these short names like Worm, Raven, Rust, Heem, Huge, Clay, Whale, Flow, the Nightwalker, that's an exception, Horn. Again, I don't know how I feel about this. But they do something interesting here where they'll have like, you know, some stats here mixed in, which I think of like maybe, you know, like a cultist or a sister or whatever. Black Wings. The Rust Brothers, from what I've read, are a pretty big part, and you see them showing up in different adventures. I don't know how I feel about any of that. It might be more to your taste. It reminds me a lot of... It's very Tolkien, if Tolkien was much darker, maybe. There's a lot of demons and stuff, and the whole setting is kind of... The basic idea is that there was this thing called a blood mist, and eventually it lifted, and now you're free to like explore this place. And there was places where, you know, people did, you know, find safety, and there are still places where there's pockets of blood mist and stuff, and there's like monsters that are specific to that. I don't think it's for me, but I'm not saying it's bad. You may like it more than I like it. And then they give, you know, a sort of layout of where the different kin and maybe monsters, depending on your opinion of, you know, like ogres, where they live. And you can sort of organize it this way. Yeah. And in this book, as they go through the different kin, they do give all of these stats for maybe a typical NPC. It's very helpful, but I don't know how easy it is to reference. Like, this isn't something you could easily find like the unruly elf or something at the table, you would need to prep this. There's, you would need to have your NPCs prepped. But then, being only 4 stats and the skills are pretty simple, I think it would be pretty easy to also just make it up on the spot. So take that for what it's worth. So this, like all of this is pretty much history in it and world building information in it. It goes for quite a while. And then you get into a bestiary. The monsters are, you know, fairly typical fantasy stuff. But they do differ quite a bit from like NPCs, where you have your 4 stats, your some skills, and armor, and whatever they're using. They might have spells and whatnot, where the monsters, many of them will have these attack tables. And I think this is interesting. I think it's a little time consuming to make one of these yourself, but I like the idea. So, for example here, it only has strength and agility, and its strength is 14. So while a character might be limited, the highest you could possibly have is 6. And that requires matching. So you'll get a by default, the max is 4, but you can get a +1 from a potential +1 from your class and from your kin. But monsters do not adhere to that. So the young worm has a strength of 14 and an agility of 2, so it might be easier to break this by just breaking its agility somehow, which is interesting. But it's also impossible to break it through wits or empathy. It'll have armor and, you know, there's different stats depending on the age and whatever. But then the attacks, you could roll this or you could pick one, and it'll give you different things to roll, and some of them seem pretty nasty. I don't know about that one. Here's a bloodling. These things come out of the blood mist. We'll get to the dragon and we'll look at that. The demons are a huge part of this game, and so there's a whole section on like creating demons, which is pretty cool. I like information on like building a type of monster. So you get like different modifiers depending on what you decide or what you roll. So you get some variety with that, which I like. Let's get to the dragon. All right. So there's a small dragon, a large dragon. A large dragon has 48 strength, 4 agility. It does have wits and empathy, so 6 and 3. So breaking it through its strength is maybe not the best idea. 48 doing 48 damage in this game is a lot of damage. Like doing like 6 damage is a huge amount, and so that's, you know, 8 times 6, so you'd have to do that 8 times. So I think it builds into it. The game does a good job of building narrative into the mechanics, where it's like it sort of mechanically there are tactics that work both into the narrative. Like, it doesn't make sense to just run up and start attacking a dragon, and it handles that very well mechanically, by incentivizing you to take other paths. That being said, the dragon has some pretty nasty attacks. Let me see. Unfortunately, sometimes they use written numbers instead of... so let's see. So perform an attack against each with 10 base dice and weapon damage 2. So this is its claw. So you would roll 10 dice for this. Let's do it. Let's just do it. There's a long video already, so might as well. Let's see. Having your dice neatly organized is probably pretty critical to this game. Here, we'll roll this. So with this, I got only 2 successes, unfortunately. I don't think you push these ever. Though, NPCs can push rolls, and when you have a running pool of willpower, so each NPC only has no NPC has their own willpower. The GM manages their own running pool of willpower, so you carry it and you can use it between NPCs, which is interesting. That aside, in this case, it would do 2 damage plus an additional 1, so I guess only 3 damage, which is not that much for a claw attack, but you can see with 10 dice how that could become pretty dangerous pretty fast, especially if your maximum potential hit points before armor is accounted for is, 6, and most players are going to have far fewer than that. You generally don't want to run up and attack things like this. There's a Drake Worm, which is, also very nasty. Ents, always fun to see. Ghosts. So they can only be hurt by fire or magic. It's interesting they put that in the armor, which is different. Some things have weak spots. So a giant attacks against the weak spot on top of the giant's head, inflict double damage. Hitting the top of the head requires a difficult ranged attack from an elevated position, or the attacker to first climb onto the grapple or onto the giant. The ladder move counts as a grapple attack. No other effects of the grapple apply in such a case. It's interesting. It's very specific, and I don't know that your players would know to do this, but that is an incentive for them to do things narratively, and then you use what's here, I guess. Giant squid, classic. Bear. Griffin. Let's see, let's just get through these. Harpies, Hydra. So you have a lot of very standard insectoids. Manticore, Minotaur, and there's a fair amount. Night Warg, Sea Serpent, Strangling Vine, Troll, Undead, which has a nice illustration. It's the thing that caught my eye. Wyvern. There's a table of animals. I mean, you run into animals a lot in games, so makes sense. And then we get into artifacts. Artifacts are basically what they call magic items in this game. There are a lot of pre-created artifacts, and the ones that are named will come in the deck if you buy the deck, for whatever that's worth. There's some boots and stuff. These are pretty cool. They're a bit different than the stuff you get in D&D, but kind of in the same vein. I don't remember any of these that stood out to me as particularly interesting, but they'll generally have a legend with them, and I think you can kind of place them however you feel. Some of them might have very specific locations, but for the most part, I think you can place them however you like, which is not very different from other games. And then there are encounters. These are kind of fun. So as you're traveling between places, you can roll for these random encounters. And so you might have, you might run into a wedding. Some of these, they'll have a description and then that you kind of read aloud, I guess. And then the scenario. Man, struggled to say that. All right. Some of them are a little maybe mundane, but in a good way, like a forest fire. They might be. There's a lot of variety here, and I do like this a lot, actually. And I would definitely use these. I would absolutely use these, and I wish there was more of them. And I hope there will be more of them, because there's 43, but I could always use a whole another set of them, because I do like this kind of thing. There's one that was kind of funny to me, which I liked. Let me find it. The dwarf balloon pilot. At a distance, you spot a green cocoon up in a tree. When you get closer, you see there's an air balloon stuck in the top of the tree. So this is a dwarf that is now stuck in a tree, but he basically went... his family was killed in an accident. He decided he didn't want to be on the ground anymore. It was killed in a collapse, so he disavowed the god Huge. But whatever, he doesn't want to touch the ground anymore, so now he flies around in an air balloon, and he'll land on buildings and go down and, like, steal things. I like that. That's pretty funny. And pretty different. Alright, anyway. Let's move on. They do have instructions and tables and stuff for building your own adventure sites. And the adventure sites are kind of broken down into different types. This helps you with placing them on the map, because they're different, like, the hexes aren't numbered or anything like that. Some of them, you know, the adventure sites require a specific kind of setting, for example. So there's villages, and they might require being on a river or something. There are dungeons, and there's tables for building all this stuff. There are castles. I think that's the only three. So you have villages, dungeons, and castles, and everything will fall into those three. I don't know if that's actually all encompassing, but it. I like the idea of it, for sure. And then placing, like, creatures and NPCs, treasures and findings. There's a lot of tables here, and this stuff all seems pretty useful. And then we get into, there are 3 adventures in the back of the book. They're the art pieces I showed at the beginning of the video. It's the Hollows, Grindbone. Oh, nope. I think I showed the wrong one. I think that was from a different book. Well, Weatherstone, which is a castle, and the Veil of the Dead. Grindbone is from one of the other books. So, let's take a look here briefly. They have a background. Getting here, there's the legend. There's always a legend. It starts with a description. They have some call out of recommended reading and type of adventure site village, so you know to put it. Let me look. The map may even have specific, yes it does. So there are, like, castle locations. You can see adventure site, village, dungeon, or castle. So you could put a village here, castle. I don't see why you couldn't put them in other locations as long as maybe they match the description. But they do have suggested locations for things. All right. So there are different events here. I've read through this one a little bit, and in the book, as opposed to the print up, the adventure locations are numbered. Doesn't matter. So they're numbered here. And so this is a little bit more useful to the GM than the actual print up is. And they have different locations. I mean, overall, like, what I've read through here seems all well and good. My only concern is I think this is going to be just a little difficult to reference at the table. You're going to be doing flipping between these pages a lot. It's not a big deal, but it's kind of annoying. I wish there was maybe another print up that had even, like, short information for all of these locations. I know these are kind of like sample locations, but it seems a little hard to run this out of the back of the GM's book. And that's going to kind of stand for all 3 of these. But the art is amazing. I love it. I have nothing more to say about that other than I love it. All right. Again, this is very similar layout. This is maybe a little bit unfortunate. They're not too long, a few pages. So, in the back of the book, there's a few legends. You could copy these if you wanted, but I would just print them up from the website. But in a pinch, you have them there. All right, so there you have it. There are, that's what's in the box, and that's Forbidden Land. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful if you're interested in this game. I may make future videos about this system, and I may actually make my own content for this game. I'm especially considering expanding on some of the stronghold ideas and probably making a few of my own adventure sites, and I might put together some information on converting as I get experience with doing that. That's especially if I end up switching to this game, which I'm considering pretty strongly right now. So overall, I really like the system. I have a few concerns with the world building that's in here, but there's no obligation to use it, of course. You can use your own worlds, and it works just fine. All right, so thank you for watching, and I hope you guys are doing well. Take care. Bye.